The shadows beneath. The small town of Black Hollow, nestled deep within the forests of upstate New York, was the kind of place people moved to escape the chaos of city life. Its winding roads, dense woods, and crisp autumn air gave it an idyllic charm. But beneath its picturesque surface lay a dark secret, one that had been buried for centuries. The old Miller house stood at the edge of town, a sprawling Victorian mansion with peeling paint, shattered windows, and a sagging porch. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last family to live there vanished without a trace. The townsfolk whispered about the house, calling it cursed, but no one dared to speak too loudly. They knew better. The house was built on sacred ground, an ancient burial site of the Lenape tribe, who had once thrived in the region. When the settlers arrived, they ignored the warnings of the indigenous people and built their homes atop the graves. The land, they said, was tainted by the spirits of the dead, who would not rest until their peace was restored. Emily Carter had always dreamed of owning a historic home. When she and her husband, Mark, stumbled upon the Miller house during a weekend getaway, they saw it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The real estate agent, a nervous man with a twitchy smile, warned them about the house's reputation, but Emily dismissed it as superstition. Mark, ever the pragmatist, agreed. They were getting the house for a steal, and with a little work, it could be their dream home. Their two children, 10-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Noah, were less enthusiastic. The house loomed over them like a shadow, its empty windows staring like hollow eyes. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly as they stepped inside, while Noah hid behind his father, refusing to let go of his hand. The first night in the house was uneventful, but as the days passed, strange things began to happen. Doors would creak open on their own, cold drafts would sweep through rooms despite the sealed windows, and faint whispers could be heard in the dead of night. Emily tried to brush it off as the settling of an old house, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. One evening, as Emily was putting the children to bed, Lily asked, "Mommy, who are the people in the walls?" Emily froze. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Lily pointed to the corner of her room. "The shadows. They move when I'm not looking, and they whisper." Emily forced a smile. "It's just your imagination, honey. Old houses make funny noises." But later that night, as she lay in bed, Emily heard it too. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. She shook Mark awake, but by the time he sat up, the sound had stopped. The next morning, Mark decided to investigate the basement. Armed with a flashlight, he descended the rickety stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was damp and cluttered with old furniture, but what caught his eye was the wall at the far end. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. Some resembled animals, while others were abstract shapes that seemed to twist and writhe the longer he looked. As he reached out to touch the wall, a sudden gust of wind extinguished his flashlight, plunging him into darkness. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding, and swore he heard a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily visited the local library, where she met an elderly librarian named Mrs. Grayson. The woman's eyes widened when Emily mentioned the Miller house. "That house is cursed," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice trembling. "It was built on sacred land that belonged to the Lenape. They warned the settlers, but no one listened. The spirits of the dead have been trapped there ever since, and they won't rest until the land is returned to them." Emily's stomach churned. "Is there any way to fix this?" Mrs. Grayson hesitated. "There are stories of rituals, offerings to appease the spirits, but no one who's tried has ever succeeded." That night, the house came alive. The whispers grew into screams, the shadows into figures that lurked in every corner. Lily and Noah huddled together in their room, clutching each other as the walls seemed to close in around them. Emily and Mark raced to their children, but the door slammed shut before they could reach them. From the basement, a deep, resonant chanting began to rise, echoing through the house. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and decay. The spirits were no longer content to linger in the shadows. They wanted revenge. Mark grabbed the doorknob, twisting it furiously, but it wouldn't budge. The chanting from the basement grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself were alive and breathing. Emily pounded on the door, calling out to Lily and Noah, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers and wails that filled the air. "We need to break it down," Mark shouted, stepping back and slamming his shoulder into the door. It didn't even creak. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. Emily's mind raced. She remembered Mrs. Grayson's words about rituals and offerings. "Mark, we have to do something. The spirits, they're angry. We need to appease them." Mark turned to her, his face pale but determined. "How? We don't even know what they want." "The basement," Emily said, her voice trembling. "The symbols on the wall, they're connected to the spirits. Maybe if we try to communicate with them." Mark hesitated, then nodded. They had no other choice. Together, they raced down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the symbols on the far wall. The chanting was deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emily approached the wall, her breath visible in the freezing air. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the carved symbols. As soon as she made contact, the chanting stopped. The silence was almost worse. "What do you want?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the symbols began to glow brighter, and a low, guttural voice echoed through the basement. It spoke in a language Emily didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. The spirits wanted justice. Mark grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back. "This is insane. We need to get out of here, now. We can't leave the kids." Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. "We have to try." The voice spoke again, louder this time, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the walls seemed to close in around them. Emily fell to her knees, clutching her head as the voices filled her mind, overwhelming her with images of death and despair. "Please," she screamed. "We didn't know. We'll do whatever you want. Just let our children go." The trembling stopped, and the voices fell silent. The symbols on the wall dimmed, and the air grew still. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance, unsure of what had just happened. Then, a single word echoed through the basement. "Offer." Emily and Mark spent the next few hours frantically searching the house for anything that could serve as an offering. They found old trinkets, pieces of jewelry, and even a dusty Bible, but nothing seemed right. The spirits wanted something meaningful, something that would show their sincerity. Finally, Emily remembered the locket she always wore around her neck. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had been deeply connected to her own heritage. Emily had always cherished it as a symbol of her family's history. She hesitated, then unclasped the locket and placed it on the floor in front of the wall. "This is all I have," she said, her voice shaking. "Please take it. Just let our children go." The symbols on the wall began to glow again, and the locket rose into the air, suspended by an unseen force. The voices returned, softer this time, almost mournful. The locket floated toward the wall, then disappeared into the stone as if it had been absorbed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door upstairs slammed open, and Lily and Noah came running down the stairs, their faces pale but unharmed. "Mom! Dad!" Lily cried, throwing herself into Emily's arms. "We heard voices, and the shadows. They were everywhere." Emily held her children tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's over now." The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The whispers were gone, the shadows still. Emily and Mark packed their belongings as quickly as they could, determined to leave Black Hollow and never return. As they drove away, Emily glanced back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, the porch sagging, but for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a shadowy silhouette that watched them go. They never spoke of what happened in the Miller house, but the experience left its mark. Lily and Noah would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, haunted by nightmares of shadows and whispers. Emily and Mark tried to reassure them, but they knew the truth. The spirits of Black Hollow were not easily appeased. Years later, Emily would sometimes find herself staring at the empty space where her locket used to be, wondering if the spirits had truly been satisfied, or if they were simply waiting for the next family to make the same mistake. The real estate agent adjusted his tie as he unlocked the door to the Miller house. The couple standing behind him looked eager, their eyes shining with excitement. "It's a bit of a fixer-upper," he said, forcing a smile. "But it's got great potential." The woman stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the dusty floors and peeling wallpaper. "It's perfect," she said, turning to her husband. "Don't you think?" He nodded, but as he followed her inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house was silent, but the air was heavy with something he couldn't quite place. Something ancient and angry. And in the basement, the symbols on the wall began to glow faintly, as if awakened by the presence of new intruders. After the Carters fled the house, it stood empty once more. But the spirits, awakened by their presence, did not rest. They grew stronger, their energy pulsating through the walls, as if the house itself craved new victims. Locals who drove past the property reported seeing strange lights flickering in the windows, even though the house was supposed to be vacant. Children whispered about shadows moving behind the curtains, but no one dared to approach. The new family who bought the house was nothing like the Carters. Jake and Sarah, a young couple from the city, had moved to Black Hollow seeking a fresh start. They were determined to turn the old house into their dream home. The rumors of a curse didn't faze them. They dismissed it as small-town superstition. The first night in the house was uneventful. Jake and Sarah laughed as they unpacked boxes, discussing their plans for the future. But as the clock struck midnight, the house began to reveal its true nature. Sarah woke up to a strange sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging against the wall from the inside. She sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound was barely audible, but it was there. Jake slept soundly beside her, oblivious. Sarah told herself it was just the old house settling and tried to go back to sleep. But a few minutes later, she heard a voice. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the corner of the room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing. Sarah got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside to let in the moonlight. The yard outside was still, the trees casting long, twisted shadows. "Jake," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Jake groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "The whispering. It's coming from over there." She pointed to the corner of the room. Jake sat up, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the scratching started again, louder this time. Jake's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" They both got out of bed, Jake grabbing a flashlight from the nightstand. The scratching seemed to move, shifting from the wall to the floor. They followed the sound, their hearts pounding, until they reached the door to the basement. "It's coming from down there," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated, then opened the door. The staircase descended into darkness, the air cold and damp. He shone the flashlight down the steps, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. "We should check it out," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. Sarah shook her head. "Not tonight. Let's just lock the door and deal with it in the morning." Jake nodded, relief evident on his face. He closed the door and turned the lock, though neither of them believed it would keep whatever was down there at bay. The next morning, Sarah decided to visit the local library. She needed to know more about the house's history. The librarian, Mrs. Grayson, recognized her immediately. "You're the ones who bought the Miller house," she said, her tone cautious. "Yes," Sarah replied. "We've been hearing strange things. I was hoping you could tell me more about the house." Mrs. Grayson sighed, her expression grim. "That house is cursed. It was built on sacred land that belonged to the Lenape tribe. They warned the settlers, but no one listened. The spirits of the dead have been trapped there ever since." Sarah's stomach churned. Is there any way to fix it? Mrs. Grayson hesitated. There are stories of rituals, offerings to appease the spirits, but no one who's tried has ever succeeded. Sarah left the library with a heavy heart. She didn't know what to believe, but the fear in Mrs. Grayson's eyes was real. That night, the house came alive. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The scratching turned into pounding, as if something was trying to break through the walls. Jake and Sarah huddled together in bed, clutching each other as the shadows in the room seemed to shift and move on their own. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And go where?" Jake replied, "We've spent everything we have on this house." Before Sarah could respond, the door to the basement burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. A cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing the lights and plunging them into darkness. From the basement, a deep, resonant chanting began to rise, echoing through the house. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and decay. The spirits were no longer content to linger in the shadows. They wanted revenge. Jake and Sarah clung to each other as the chanting grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of anger and despair. The house seemed to pulse with energy, the walls vibrating as if they were alive. The symbols on the basement walls glowed brighter, casting an eerie green light that seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. "We have to do something," Sarah shouted over the noise, her voice trembling with fear. Jake nodded, though his face was pale and his hands shook. "The basement. We have to face whatever's down there." Sarah hesitated, but she knew they had no choice. Together, they descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was a nightmare come to life. Shadows twisted and writhed on the walls, and the symbols glowed with an otherworldly light. In the center of the room, the floor had cracked open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From the hole, a figure began to emerge. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long and its face a twisted mask of rage. The spirits had taken physical form, and they were not happy. Sarah remembered Mrs. Grayson's words about offerings. She frantically searched her pockets, finding a small pendant she always carried, a gift from her grandmother. She held it out, her hand shaking. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chanting. "Take this. We didn't know. We didn't mean to disturb you." The figure paused, its head tilting as if considering her words. The chanting softened, and the symbols on the walls dimmed slightly. Jake, seeing an opportunity, grabbed an old, dusty book from a nearby shelf. It was filled with strange symbols and text, but one page stood out, a ritual for appeasing restless spirits. "Sarah, we need to do this," Jake said, his voice urgent. "It's our only chance." Together, they followed the instructions in the book, placing the pendant in the center of the room and reciting the words written on the page. The air grew still and the chanting stopped. The figure in the hole let out a final, ear-piercing scream before collapsing into the darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the house began to shake violently, as if the spirits were fighting against the ritual. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, and the hole in the floor began to close. When the shaking stopped, the basement was silent. The symbols on the walls were gone, and the hole in the floor had disappeared, leaving no trace of what had happened. Jake and Sarah sat on the floor, exhausted and trembling. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "I think so, but we can't stay here. Not after this." They packed their belongings that same night, leaving the house and the town of Black Hollow behind. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, the porch sagging, but for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a shadowy silhouette that watched them go. Months later, the house stood empty once more. The real estate agent, desperate to sell the property, downplayed the rumors of hauntings. A new family arrived, eager to start fresh in the countryside. They were unaware of the house's dark history, of the spirits that still lingered in the shadows. As they stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the whispers began again. The symbols on the basement walls glowed faintly, and the spirits stirred, ready to claim their next victims. The new family, the Thompsons, had no idea what they were walking into. Mark and Laura Thompson, along with their teenage daughter, Claire, had moved to Black Hollow from the city, seeking a quieter life. They were drawn to the old Victorian house by its charm and the low price tag. The real estate agent had been vague about the house's history, mentioning only that it needed some work. As they unloaded their belongings, Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced up at the house, its windows dark and foreboding. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered. "Don't be silly," Laura said, though she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach. "It's just an old house. It'll feel like home once we fix it up." Mark, ever the optimist, nodded in agreement. "We'll make it our own. Just wait and see." The first night in the house was uneventful, but Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The house was too quiet, the silence almost oppressive. She reached for her phone, scrolling through social media to distract herself. Then, she heard it, a faint whisper, like someone calling her name. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, but there was no response. The whisper came again, louder this time. Claire got out of bed and opened her door, peering into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. She took a step forward, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper turned into a low, guttural growl, coming from the direction of the basement. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run back to her room, but something compelled her to move forward, toward the source of the sound. Claire reached the basement door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. She turned the knob and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. The basement was pitch black, the air cold and damp. Claire fumbled for the light switch, but when she flipped it, nothing happened. She pulled out her phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the stairs. As she descended, the beam of light caught something on the wall. Strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. She reached out to touch one of the symbols, but as soon as her fingers made contact, a sharp pain shot through her hand. She yelped, pulling back, and the symbols began to glow faintly. The growling returned, louder and more menacing, and Claire realized she wasn't alone. Claire turned to run, but the stairs seemed to stretch out endlessly before her. The growling turned into a deafening roar, and the shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. She stumbled, falling to her knees, as the symbols on the walls glowed brighter. "Claire!" Laura's voice echoed from upstairs. "Where are you?" Claire tried to call out, but her voice was caught in her throat. The shadows closed in around her, their forms taking shape, tall, distorted figures with glowing eyes and twisted limbs. They reached for her, their touch icy cold. "Leave me alone!" Claire screamed, covering her face with her hands. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, and the lights flickered on. The shadows disappeared, and the symbols on the walls dimmed. Claire was alone, trembling on the basement floor. The next morning, Claire told her parents what had happened. At first, they were skeptical, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. Mark decided to investigate the basement, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar. As he descended the stairs, he noticed the symbols on the walls. They were faint but unmistakable. He reached out to touch one, but Laura stopped him. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong with this house. We need to find out what it is." They visited the local library, where they met Mrs. Grayson. The librarian's face paled when they mentioned the Miller house. "That house is cursed," she said, her voice low. "It was built on sacred land, and the spirits of the dead have been trapped there ever since. No one who's lived there has stayed for long." Laura's heart sank. "Is there any way to fix it?" Mrs. Grayson hesitated. "There are stories of rituals, offerings to appease the spirits, but no one who's tried has ever succeeded. That night, the Thompsons decided to perform the ritual. They gathered what little they had, a family heirloom, a lock of Claire's hair, and a piece of jewelry, and placed them in the center of the basement. They recited the words from the old book, their voices trembling. The house began to shake, the walls groaning as if in pain. The symbols on the walls glowed brightly, and the shadows returned, more menacing than ever. The spirits had been awakened, and they were not happy. "We didn't know," Laura cried, tears streaming down her face. "Please, take these offerings and leave us in peace." The shaking stopped, and the symbols dimmed. The shadows retreated, and the air grew still. For a moment, the Thompsons thought it was over. Then, the floor beneath them cracked open, and a figure emerged. A tall, twisted form with glowing eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. It let out a deafening roar, and the Thompsons realized too late that the spirits would never be satisfied. The Thompsons fled the house that night, leaving behind everything they owned. They never returned to Black Hollow, and the house stood empty once more. But the spirits remained, waiting for the next family to make the same mistake. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, a reminder of the curse that would never be broken. And in the darkness of the basement, the figure watched, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was only a matter of time before the house claimed its next victims. Years passed, and the Miller house remained abandoned, its dark history fading into local legend. The townsfolk of Black Hollow avoided the property, crossing the street when they passed by. Children dared each other to approach the house, but no one ever stayed long. The air around it was too cold, the silence too heavy. One day, a young couple arrived in town, their car packed with boxes and dreams. They had heard about the old Victorian house on the edge of town, its price too good to pass up. The real estate agent, now older and more jaded, handed them the keys without a word of warning. As they stepped inside, the house seemed to sigh, the walls creaking as if awakening from a long slumber. The symbols in the basement glowed faintly, and the shadows in the corners began to stir. The cycle was beginning again.